Let's dive right in. We're about to explore a really fascinating and honestly a counterintuitive way of looking at power. So I want you to forget everything you think you know about influence, about being seen, because today we're conducting an audit of your invisibility. And boom, right off the bat, here's the core idea that flips everything upside down. The whole point here is that the very act of being visible, of being noticed, it doesn't make you powerful. No, it actually exposes you. It makes you vulnerable. So here's our game plan. We're going to start with the problem itself, the visibility trap. Then we'll get into the solution, which is called the law of influence. After that, we'll look at a cautionary tale, the transparent fool. And then finally, we'll break down the how-to, the shadow protocol. All right, so let's get into the meat of it. The source material calls this pathological hunger to be seen the primary failure of the unrefined mind. It's this deep-seated idea we all have that to be a leader, you have to be in the spotlight, that to have any influence, you've got to have the loudest voice in the room. Now, this is where it gets really interesting, because it shows how the danger just unfolds in this logical chain. See, when you're seen, your actions, your patterns, your desires, they all get mapped. And once you're mapped, well, your behavior becomes predictable. And what happens to anything that's predictable? You got it. It can be controlled. And this line just perfectly illustrates the consequence, doesn't it? Most people are basically addicts of recognition, but every time they make a public declaration, they're just handing the system another thread to bind them with. Trying to live a life of total transparency, it's literally like building this beautiful, intricate monument out of glass while you're surrounded by people throwing stones. It's just not going to last. So the crucial distinction here is between what's real authority and what just looks like authority. You have the performer who desperately wants to be in the center of the room, soaking up all the attention, but then you have the architect. The architect is the one with the real power. They operate from the blind spots. In fact, they're the one who designed the very room the performer is standing in. True authority doesn't need an audience. Okay, so if being visible is a trap, what's the way out? This brings us to our second section. The source calls the alternative structural subtlety, or the law of hidden influence. Think of it as this kind of poetic science of governing yourself. Now this is a huge shift in thinking. The goal isn't to persuade people or win an argument. No, it's to alter the entire environment, the actual underlying structure where decisions get made. You're not trying to change what people think. You're changing the options they have to choose from in the first place. You're changing the very geometry of their choices. Now, to make this idea really solid, the source material gives us this, a governing formula called the hidden influence constant. Now, I know, it looks a little complex, but its purpose is actually pretty simple. It's a way to measure your ability to exert that silent, hidden influence over time. Okay, let's break this down real quick. Up top, in the numerator, that's your power. That's how effective your camouflage is, your ability to blend in, times the quality of your actual signal. But on the bottom, that's the predator. That's the environment's ability to detect you. Plus, what might be the most dangerous part of all, your own ego, your biological need to get the credit. So when you maximize this constant, the goal isn't just to influence things in the way we normally think about it. It's way, way more fundamental than that. It's about making your own intent into a kind of localized law of nature, to the point where you're basically re-rendering the default settings of the world around you. Which, of course, brings us to our third section. What happens if you fail to learn this lesson? Well, then you become the archetype of the transparent fool. You become a victim of the very attention you thought you wanted. I mean, what a powerful analogy, right? A king in a den of thieves thinks his shiny crown is a symbol of his power, but really, it's just the glitter that shows the thieves exactly where to aim the blade. The performance of power is what attracts the greatest danger. And so you end up with two completely different fates. On one hand, you have the architect who owns the space and governs from the shadows and keeps their sovereignty. But then there's the transparent fool. By always needing to be seen, they become a public asset. They're just a predictable node in a network, a commodity for the system to use up and then just throw away. This might be the most radical idea in this whole explainer. We're taught our whole lives to be terrified of being forgotten, to fear being irrelevant. But here, being forgotten is completely reframed. It's the ultimate strategic advantage. It's the only way to operate, to really govern without the world constantly pushing back against you. All right, let's get to our final section, the actionable part. This is all great in theory, but how do you actually do it? Well, the source lays out a very clear set of instructions. It's called the Shadow Protocol, the Architecture of Invisibility. There are 3 core commands here. First, ego liquidation. You have to audit your own need for credit and kill it. Get rid of that performer inside you. If you need people to know you were the one who did it, you've already lost. Second, structural masking. You have to hide your real intentions inside boring, everyday actions. You have to become invisible background radiation. And third, sub-perceptual decree. Your influence has to be so subtle, so consistent, that it operates below anyone's threshold of detection. So what's the end result of all this? If you actually follow this protocol, you stop being a visible actor in the play. Instead, you become something more like a fundamental force. You're a silent, unseen law of your environment. Your will becomes part of the system's physics. And this line just perfectly captures that final state of mastery. You see, you're not the light. You're not the performer in the spotlight. You are the unseen force, the shadow, that actually determines the shape and the direction of the light itself. So after all of this, we're left with one really crucial question to ask ourselves. In our own lives, in our own search for influence and meaning, are we the ones building the unseen structures that actually shape reality? Or are we just the billboard, brightly lit, sure, but ultimately just advertising someone else's message? You know, we live in a world that is just obsessed with being seen, right? Getting noticed, building a brand. But what if I told you that true power, it's the exact opposite, that it actually lies in being invisible? Forget the spotlight. Today, we are stepping into the sovereign shadow to really understand how unseen influence actually works. All right, let's just dive right in with the core principle that underpins everything we're going to talk about today. This idea is so profound because think about it. The moment you become a known quantity, a predictable pattern, you've essentially just handed the controls over to somebody else. So, first up, we're going to tackle something that's practically baked into our culture. This idea that to be powerful, you have to be visible. We're going to explore why that constant hunger for recognition, well, it might not be an asset at all. In fact, it might be your single greatest liability. And wow, this slide just lays it out, doesn't it? On one hand, you have what we all instinctively believe, that to have influence, you have to be like the sun, radiating light. But then there's the clinical reality, which is much, much harsher. Visibility makes you a target. It turns you into a monument of glass in a world full of people throwing stones. And here's where it gets really counterintuitive. The more you shout about what you're doing, the more you broadcast your plans, you're not just announcing your presence, you're actually creating friction. You're inviting the environment itself to push back and organize its resistance against you. So what's the alternative? Well, it's this. Real authority doesn't need a megaphone. It doesn't need to be the loudest voice. True authority operates from the blind spots. It's not about being the person standing in the middle of the room. It's about being the architect who designed the room in the first place. Okay, so let's take this idea and build it out into something more concrete, what the source material calls a poetic science. This isn't just a vague philosophy, it's a fundamental law based on deep structural subtlety. This is a huge shift in thinking. We're not talking about persuasion here, not trying to change someone's mind. The law of hidden influence is about changing the geometry of choice itself. You're literally altering the landscape of reality, carving pathways so that other people, acting on what they believe is their own free will, naturally choose the path you design for them. And this isn't just some abstract philosophy. The archive actually quantifies this. They call it the hidden influence constant. Think of it as a variable that measures your real ability to subtly reshape your environment from the shadows. Okay, so this table really breaks it all down. Think of it like an equation for power. On one side, you have your strengths, how good your cognitive camouflage is, and the purity of your actual goal. But then you have to subtract the 2 things that are always hunting you: the environment's ability to spot you, and maybe most dangerously, your own ego's desperate biological need to get the credit. So, what happens when you get this equation totally wrong, when you ignore this fundamental law? Well, you become what the archive calls the transparent fool. This is the person who, tragically, fatally, mistakes the performance of power for the real thing. And this image, wow, it just perfectly captures the tragedy of the transparent fool. He's that king, so proud of his shiny crown, thinking it's his armor. He has no idea that the glitter, That's the very thing guiding the knife right to his neck. The thing is, the system we live in, it's literally designed to create these fools. It feeds on your desire to be known. It gives you these little hits of dopamine, likes, shares, public praise, for being transparent. And all that does is make you a visible, predictable, and totally manageable node in a network that you will never, ever control. And the source material points to a specific, almost painful moment of clarity, around age 45. This is when the transparent fool suddenly looks up and realizes the horrifying truth. They haven't built a life, they've become a public asset, a commodity to be used up and then thrown away. And it all boils down to this absolutely brutal distinction. You have to ask yourself, are you the architect, or are you just the billboard? Are you building the structure, or are you just a bright, shiny advertisement hanging on a building that someone else owns? Okay, so if that's the trap, how do you escape it? How do you actually claim sovereignty and become the architect? Well, there's a protocol for that. It's about making a conscious choice to move from the visible light into the invisible infrastructure.
It's called the Shadow Protocol, and it breaks down into 3 key steps: ego liquidation, structural masking, and sub-perceptual decree. So let's look at what these actually mean in practice.
All right, let's walk through this. Step 1, ego liquidation. This is about auditing your deep biological need for credit. You have to kill the performer inside you to give birth to the architect. Because if you need the world to know you did it, you've already lost the power to do it again. Step 2, structural masking. You have to hide your real intentions behind the mundane, the boring, the repetitive. Become the unnoticed background radiation of your environment. And finally, step 3, sub-perceptual decree. Your actions, your influence, have to operate below the normal threshold of detection. So subtle and so consistent that people just mistake it for common sense, for the way things have always been. And when you execute this protocol correctly, this is the endgame. This is where you want to be. You're no longer the thing being seen. Instead, you are the shadow that decides the shape of the light itself. You are the invisible cause. The visible world is simply your effect. So that leaves us with one final question, a kind of personal audit, really. Are you the shadow, actively shaping the reality around you? Or are you just a shape, a silhouette, being defined and controlled by a light that isn't your own? So the ultimate takeaway is this: real, lasting power doesn't come from the noise and the spectacle of the stage. It comes from the silence. It comes from the deep structural shadows where reality itself is quietly written into being.